Hello everyone, UnrealSensei here, and have you ever watched a movie or played a game and wished that you could create your own science fiction or fantasy worlds? Well, you are just in luck. In this video, I'm going to go over how to use Unreal Engine and Kitbash 3D to create a science fiction planetary settlement like the one you see right here. All of the buildings, spaceships, and rovers are high-quality assets crafted by Kitbash 3D. Every asset in this video is free, so you can follow along. We will go over everything you need to know to create your own sci-fi settlement, including how to navigate and move objects in Unreal, set up planetary lighting, download and incorporate Kitbash 3D assets to populate your environment, animate the assets to breathe life into your world, and finally render out a movie using Unreal's sequencer. To get started, we first have to download a free kit from kitbash3d.com. Kitbash is home to the industry's most premium and versatile 3D assets. These assets have been used across the industry in many of your favorite movies and video games. With them, you can build any world you want, whether that's a cyberpunk city, post-apocalyptic war zone, or a pirate cove. Kitbash 3D has everything you need, but for now we are going to download this one, Mission to Minerva, a free kit handcrafted for us to create science fiction space settlements. Kitbash supports a bunch of programs, but since we are using Unreal Engine, select Unreal, and then hit the download button. To start off, I want to create a blank project, so go to Games and make sure blank is selected. I also want to turn on starter content, so we get some basic assets at the beginning. Now, it's right now going to save on my desktop, that's fine. And for the project name, I'm going to call this one Minerva Outpost, and create. This is what you will see if you selected starter content. In the middle right here is our viewport. This is our camera or our window into our world. So the controls are pretty simple, especially if you ever play a first-person shooter. You want to hold down the right mouse button and move the mouse to look around. So that's right mouse button held down, and use the WASD keys to move around. You can also use E and Q to move up and down. If you want to control the speed of your camera, up here in camera speed, you can turn that up, and now we're going really fast. Or you could bring it down to go pretty slow. You could even press the G key to go into game view mode, since obviously the player or our animation won't show all these editor widgets. If you press the G key, you can hide them. Now, in order to add a new object into my world, I need to go into the content drawer. So in the bottom left-hand corner, we have content drawer. I can select that to bring it up, or I can press Control and space. So the content drawer contains everything that is in my project. So all of my levels, textures, and objects are saved within the content drawer. And we can see that under starter content, I have a bunch of folders with assets inside of them. I can go into props, and now I can drag out a brand new chair, or maybe even a different prop like a couch. Now you might be wondering, how exactly do we add more assets to the content drawer? Because right now we're just limited to the starter content. And I want to add some of the premium Kitbash assets that we've already downloaded. Well, we can do so with a process called migration. To begin, you want to open up the zip folder, and you will see that it is already an Unreal Engine project. Now, I can't open it up from the zip. I first have to unzip this into a brand new folder. So I'm going to right click, create a new folder, and call this one Minerva Kitbash. So I'm going to open up my brand new folder, highlight all the zipped content, and unzip it into the new folder. Now that the project is unzipped, I can open it up. With a new project, press Control Space to see the assets. We have Mission to Minerva with a bunch of actors and Kitbash assets that we're going to use to create our space settlement. And we need to copy these assets into my original project. And to do that, I'm going to right click on the folder that contains all my assets called Mission to Minerva, and down here, select Migrate. Now it's going to gather a list of all the assets we're going to copy into my old project. This looks correct, so select OK. And now it's going to ask for the destination of the project we want to copy these assets into. And when we created the Minerva Outpost project, we saved it onto the desktop. So it's going to be located right here into my project folder and content. So let's copy that path, paste it right there, and select folder. So now it's copying the files into the content folder of my main project. Okay, so it looks like it was successful. I'm going to exit out the Kitbash project since I no longer need it. Because if I go into the content drawer of my original project, we have a brand new folder called Mission to Minerva with all the actors and 3D assets that make up my Kitbash kit. But we're not going to use the Kitbash assets just yet because we first have to create the landscape. To create an amazing landscape for our scene, we can grab objects such as cliffs, rocks, and ground assets from a sample that is included in Unreal Engine 5. So you want to go into the Samples tab, and down here we have the Valley of the Ancient demo. Select it and download it, and then save it onto your desktop. Make sure you have enough space for this pack because it is pretty large. Alright, now that the project has been downloaded, we need to open it up. I only want to migrate the terrain objects located in Ancient Content, Geometry, and Mass. So I want to migrate all these assets, so I need to just migrate the Mass folder as a whole. Now I don't want to move over all these folders, so deactivate Audio, Control Rig, Niagara, and only have Game selected. Click OK, navigate to Original Projects Content folder, and migrate. We are back in the original Minerva Outpost project, and if I press Ctrl and Space, we have all the assets that we need. If I want to use Kitbash 3D, then I select Mission to Minerva, go to Actors, and I can pick any of these and drag it out, and the asset is ready to go. Or if I want to add ground and terrain, then I go to Ancient Content, Geometry, Mass, and select any of these large meshes right here. So if I want ground, I can drag that out. Or if I want a cliff, then I can find a cliff, like right here, and drag that out. Before we can start creating our environment, let's first go over how to move, rotate, and scale objects. I want to use as an example a specific object that is located in Content, Mission to Minerva, Actors, and scroll all the way down until we have this vehicle rover, and drag that into my viewport. To move any object, you first want to make sure that object is selected, and then you'll get this little widget right here that's made up of 3 arrows. If I ever want to move this, then I can hold down the left mouse button on one of the arrows and drag. So that's left mouse button and dragging. Or I can hover in the middle of 2 arrows onto the square and lock it in 2 axes. Now you'll probably notice, and this is more noticeable if I zoom in, that when I do move it around, there's a little bit of snapping going on. That's because in the top right hand corner, snapping is turned on. I can select this button to make it not blue, and now snapping is turned off, so we get smooth movements. Now if I want to rotate an object, then I can select the rotation tool. I can rotate it in all 3 of these different axes, but as you can tell, we also have rotation snapping turned on. So if I come up here, I can deselect that to get smooth rotation. And finally, if I ever want to scale an object, select the scale tool up here, and I can scale it on a specific axis, or I can hover in the middle onto the white square to scale it uniformly. And we do have scale snapping turned on by default, so turn it off up there. So you slowly start to decrease it. That's how it's the size of my chair and tables. The shortcut is to press W to get the movement gizmo, E to get the rotation, and R to get scaling. So that's W for movement, E for rotation, and R to scale. If we ever want to rotate it or move it along its local axis, then you can select this button to change it right there. And you can select that button again to bring back world space movement. You can also hold down Shift to select multiple objects so you can move them together. Now that we know how to get and move objects, let's start creating the environment. I am not going to use this map right here. Instead, I will create a brand new map from a template. And select Basic, and click Create. This is the level we are going to create our planetary settlement in. As you can see, there's already lighting set up for us. We will leave the lighting for now, but in the future we are going to change it. Now this level does not exist in my project yet. So I need to press Ctrl and S to save this level, and it's going to ask for a location. I'm going to create a brand new folder, call it Maps, and let's call this Minerva Outpost. And now this map is located within my content browser and Maps. So I can double click on this whenever I want to open it up. First thing I'm going to do is create a camera and place the main shot. That's so I know exactly where to create my environment and where the animation will be. So click on the plus button up here, and down here under cinematics, drag in the Cine camera actor. So already in the bottom right hand corner, we see a preview of the camera. Another way to move this camera around is to right click and select pilot camera actor. Now our viewport camera is inside of the main camera. And if I move the viewport around, the camera also moves around. So let me go move back a little bit. And I can also play with the focal length of the detail panel. So I think if I zoom out, focal length of around 17 is pretty good. And if I like my shot, I can always unpilot this camera by selecting the eject button. And as you can see, our camera did move. Also, if the editor grid or any of the widgets are distracting you, you can press the G key to hide them. To start creating the planetary settlement, we first have to open ancient content, geometry, mass, and use all these different terrain objects. So to start off, I can drag out ground and just place it like right there. And I can select another mass and also drag that out. And I can slowly start to build on my environment. There is no secret when it comes to this phase of the environment build. I recommend to experiment, go through all the different objects from the Valley of the Ancient demo, see which ones you like, and just use them. Before I continue building out my level, a couple things I want to mention. Number one, by default, Unreal has auto exposure turned on. So if I come to a dark area, like right here, my camera automatically gets brighter. And then if I go away, our camera automatically gets darker. And that can be distracting at times. So the way that we turn that off is to come up to the add button, go into volumes, and then add in a post-process volume. So drag that out. We're going to get this little square. And with that square selected in the details panel, scroll all the way down until we have infinite extend unbound. Make sure that's turned on. So this post-process volume affects my entire world. And at the very top, under exposure, for metering mode, change that from auto exposure to manual. Now I can manually increase the exposure, and I'm going to leave it at a value of 10.5 for now. Of course, in the future, we're going to change it. Another thing that I like to do is you'll notice that we do have a lot of objects in my world, but it's hard to tell exactly what size the object is. So we can add in a human reference to help us with scale. To do so, and this is completely optional, I like to go to add feature or content pack, and then select third person and add to project. After you've added to project, within content, we have characters, go into mannequins, meshes, and we can drag out skm_Manny for a human reference. So now we know exactly how large each of these objects are. And speaking of objects, let's say I really like an object and I don't want to have to navigate into my content browser and find what that object is. To create a brand new one, I can press Ctrl and D to duplicate. That is Ctrl and D to duplicate an object, or a shortcut is to have the object selected and hold down Alt and drag. So that's holding down Alt and dragging is a shortcut to duplicating. And one last thing I want to mention is if you select your camera and you always want to see this camera preview window, in the bottom left hand corner we have this pin icon. Select it, and now whenever I select another object to move that around, that camera will always be at the bottom right hand corner. And since we did change the brightness, I also want to change the brightness of the camera with the current aperture. So this will change the exposure. If I bring this up, it's going to bring the exposure down to, let's go 3.5. Also, I'm going to move this back a little. First thing I'm going to do is work on the foreground. Since that should only be rock and desert, I'm finding different ground objects that I like and then placing them next to each other. Also, to save time, I select multiple objects by holding down the Shift key. And then with these objects selected, I duplicate all of them as a group to very quickly fill in gaps in the terrain. Do not worry about performance when you are using these really dense meshes. Nanite is already enabled on all of them, so it will not slow down the engine. Feel free to use as many rock meshes as you like. At this point, I'm just experimenting, going through all the available objects, and when I find an object that I like, I move it off to the side so that I can use it later. Notice that I'm still changing the camera's position. For this environment, I decided the right side of the camera will look down a valley because I thought that it makes a nice composition, but this is your planet, not mine. I highly recommend that you create something entirely different from me. And finally, at the end, I'm adding very large objects to make up the background. That's how, from our specific camera angle, the viewer won't be able to tell that the world is just floating in space. Instead, it feels like it is just one part of a larger environment. And just like that, very quickly, we were able to create a beautiful looking desert environment, ready for us to start using Kitbash 3D assets. To start using the Mission to Minerva assets in our scene, go to the Mission to Minerva folder, and actors. So right here, we get a bunch of different assets we can use to create a science fiction settlement. Now, maybe these are settlers trying to establish a brand new civilization, or they're miners trying to extract the planet's resources. These kits really have infinite potential to tell stories. In this case, I'm going to make it a mine, so we're going to make heavy use of containers and cranes to give it a very industrial look. Kitbash 3D provide a ton of assets in their kits, so I recommend that you take a couple minutes to go through them to see what they look like and how they can contribute to your world. Or alternatively, and you don't have to do this, you could go off to the side of the map where the camera or player will never see them and lay out all the objects so you know exactly what you can use. And right here we have all the objects under the actors folder laid out. And obviously there is a lot for us to work with. We have an entire road system, massive towers, a dome where the entire community of settlers can gather, spaceships, and down here, rovers, pretty much everything you need to create a science fiction settlement. I want to point out that all the assets under the actors folder are actually not individual objects. Instead, they're a collection of objects. For example, if I select this ship right here and select edit in blueprint, we're going to open up this ship and you'll notice that the ship isn't just one object. Instead, it's a collection of several objects that are connected to each other to create a larger object as a whole. And if we want to see what those individual objects are, which all the assets you see are created from, then instead of going into the actors folder, you go into the geometry folder. So here are all the individual static meshes. This is part of the reason why Kitbash 3D is such a powerful tool. It gives us the artist the ability to create our own objects or structures from connecting smaller meshes. This is called modular design, and it is when you can easily fit different pieces together to make a larger object. It is best to show what it is with an example. Over here, I'm dragging out several different meshes, and they all fit together since they were handcrafted to be used with each other. I often compare modular design and Kitbash to building a Lego set. If you connect enough pieces together, you can create something entirely new, like a spaceship, a giant robot, or even a space settlement like what we're doing right here. And now it's time for the fun part, and that is creating the majority of the environment with the Kitbash 3D assets. Now, just because I made my terrain first, doesn't mean I can't still change it. You will notice that about half the time, I'm still editing the terrain to make it fit better with the Kitbash objects. I also noticed that the valley was a little bit too small, so I decided to move the terrain and make it larger. Also, I'm always going back to my original camera to check on the composition or change the angle. As a reminder, this camera will be used as my main animation, so I want to make sure that the location and composition feels right. I'm continuously using the third-person character as a human reference to double check that the scale of my objects are correct. The last thing we want is a building or staircase being too small or too big. Because this part is time-lapse, this process might look a lot more complicated than it actually is. I'm not introducing anything new or using some secret trick. All I'm doing is adding new objects and moving them around and seeing what looks best. It is just like playing with Lego as a kid. Thanks to Kitbash 3D and Unreal Engine, we have all the pieces available for us. It is our job to connect the pieces and finish the set. I encourage you to not follow what I'm doing exactly. Really experiment with all the objects and create something brand new that is unique to your own planet. I'm creating an industrial mine. You can easily switch out some of the assets and instead create a lived-in settlement or maybe a space pirate hideout. The possibilities are endless. The choice is up to you what to make. This video is really a rough guide on how to get there. Now that we have blocked out our scene, let's add a little bit more variation and depth to the background. I'm using just one object stacked on top of itself to represent a tower or smokestack, which will be behind everything. It gives the illusion that there is more buildings or structures behind the valley. And one last thing I'm going to do, and that is fill in the end of the valley here with a little bit of terrain, since it was noticeable from the camera that the terrain just ended there. Now I'm adding finishing touches. I noticed some of the Kitbash objects were floating in space, so I had to create new terrain so the objects have something to rest on. Also, sometimes there might be holes in the floor, So I quickly patched them up with a rock or ground asset. At the end here, I'm adding in small objects like barrels and cargo clutter to make the environment feel more lived in. It helps make the environment look more realistic, since you would expect some containers to be stored outside of the structures. I'm placing the smaller objects in areas that make sense, like next to a power plant or living quarters. It wouldn't make sense to add a barrel in the middle of the valley, away from all the structures where it's hard to access. Congratulations, we're now pretty much done with the majority of the environment. Of course, we can always change things, but for now we're going to move on to lighting, because lighting is the quickest way to make our environment feel like we are on an alien world. Right now we are using Unreal's default lighting that came with this level template. I want to start from complete scratch, so I need to delete all my lighting widgets. As a reminder, to see widgets, press the G key. So I'm going to delete the sun, atmosphere, skylights, and clouds. Also, we don't see it right here, but if I type in fog, we're going to get the exponential height fog. I also want to delete that. So now we have no lighting in our world. It's pitch black, except for some of the emissive materials. So to begin, let's go over probably the most essential light, and that is the directional light. As you can guess, the directional light is our sunlight. So if I rotate this around, we change the direction of our sun. Or, as a shortcut, we can also hold down Ctrl and L to get up a new gizmo and then move the mouse. So that's Ctrl and L and moving the mouse to change the direction of the sun this way. Let's leave it right there for now. There's a lot of different settings, but the most essential one, since we are using Lumen, is to set mobility to movable. Also, if you think the shadow is too sharp, you can bring up the source angle to soften it. We could leave the lighting as is if our planet or moon didn't have any atmosphere, but if we do want to add an atmosphere, then go to Add button, Visual Effects, and drag in a sky and atmosphere system. Now, by default, this atmosphere is simulating Earth's. So if you go into the settings, you'll see ground radius is set to 6,360 kilometers. And that is the exact radius of Earth. Now, let's say I want to simulate what an atmosphere would be like on the moon. Then instead of using 6,000, I would use 1,740, which is the radius of the moon in kilometers. I'm going to leave it at 1,000. So this is a really small planet or moon. We could change the atmospheric scattering right here. So maybe we want it to kind of be like a Martian orange. Change the color. And if I go down to art direction, we can even boost what this color looks like by changing the color right there and make it an even deeper reddish atmosphere. This is scattering the light all in real time. So as I move my light around, the color of the sky also changes. Now, just because we do have a sky doesn't mean it's casting any light. We need to add in a skylight for it to cast light. So go into lights, skylight, and drag it out. Now you want to set this to real-time capture and also set it to movable. Now the color of the sky is being projected onto the environment, and it has a very reddish tint right now. So let's go into the sky and atmosphere, and we can change it right here. So for Rayleigh scattering, I can bring this down, or for sky luminous factor, I can do a really wild color like purple, and you'll see that the lighting of my environment changes with the sky because we added in a skylight. Now another thing I'm going to add in is an exponential height fog, since the bottom half of the world is completely black, and we can hide that with fog. So click the Add button, Visual Effects, and drag in exponential height fog. Now the environment has depth. Objects at the distance are faded, which makes them look like they're far away. You can also increase the fog to make it look like the environment has a lot of dust. So on our fog density, bring that up to 0.05. This helps to add that extra layer of atmosphere to really sell the idea that this is a large valley on an alien planet. And with the fog selected, I can bring it up to then add in more fog. So if you bring this up, as you can see, we're able to control where the fog starts. I'm going to leave it close to the ground for now. Now that all my lights are in my world, I'm going to start making final adjustments. So to start off with the exponential height fog, I'm going to set its fog density back to its default value of 0.02 because I thought it was a little bit too intense. And I also want to change the color of the fog a little bit. That's how it's kind of like a darkish brown color to make it match the atmosphere more. And I'm also going to enable volumetric fog, which will scatter the sunlight in the fog. I'm going to bring down the scattering distribution to, let's go, negative 0.39. And also to turn down the volumetric fog, I can bring down its albedo value right there. So now, if I hold down Control now to rotate my sun, we can see that there is just a little bit of volumetric distribution. Speaking of the sun, I'm going to select the directional light and increase its intensity to 17 and lower its angle so that it's coming off from the side right there. To make the fog distribution stand out more, scroll down and then enable light shaft occlusion and bloom. Now, obviously this bloom is way too intense, so we're going to bring down its scale to 0.01. Lighting is probably one of the most important parts to any environment. These are just the light settings I found to look the best. I encourage you to experiment with all these parameters and see what looks best for your planet. Now it's time to breathe the life into our planet with animations. So to create animation, we first need to create a sequencer. Come up to this button and select Add Level Sequence. It's going to ask us for a location to save it in. I'm going to create a brand new folder and call it Cinematics. For the name, this is Minerva Sequence, and select Save. Now we get this brand new window at the bottom, which will be our timeline. If we ever exit out of this window, then we can always go back and select our sequencer, scroll up and select Open Level Sequence to get it back. To add our camera to the timeline, come to Track and select Camera Cut Track. With that selected, click on the plus button and add the camera that's already inside of our world right there. So now if I select this camera button, we're going to see exactly what the animation will render out. To animate in Unreal is pretty simple. You use keyframes like every other program. So you first want to add a track for the object that you're going to animate. Luckily for us, our camera actor is already here. If it's not, then you want to click on the track button and add an actor. I'm going to click on the add button right here and select transform, which will be how we animate location. To move around inside of the camera, instead of selecting our camera cuts icon, select the one below it. Now I can move this camera and I'm going to go back just a little bit, and to add a keyframe, click on the plus button. So I added a brand new keyframe here at 000. If the keyframe was somewhere else, you can always select that keyframe and drag it back to the start. So now I'm going to go move my red cursor on my timeline all the way back here at the very end, and then move in just a little bit, like right here. And click on the plus button again in between the two icons to set a keyframe. Now Unreal is going to interpolate in between the first keyframe and the last. If I press the space bar, that will play the timeline, and we can see the exact animation that we have with our camera. You will notice that for every animation, there's a speed up and then a slow down. So automatically Unreal adds that. If I want a linear animation, so there is no speed up or slow down in between the keyframes, I can select both keyframes by holding down Shift, right click, and select linear. So now we get a very basic animation of the camera moving into our environment. Now let's add flying ships to the background. So let's go to Mission to Minerva, Actors, and scroll all the way down here until we have the cargo ship. So drag that out. And in my opinion, this ship is way too large. So I'm going to scale it down while keeping in mind this human reference right there until it is the right size. Like, I think that is a good size. Also, at the back here is open, so we're going to have to fix that. And I notice that I am piloting my camera. So to unpilot, I can click on the eject button right there, or I can select the camera icon again. Now, if you remember, actors are made up of a bunch of other objects. And I can change these objects by individually selecting them. So I don't need this ramp. I'm going to scroll down, select the ramp. That's how this ramp is selected. And then within the details panel, we're going to have to scroll down until we get to rendering and uncheck visibility to get rid of that. Same thing with the struts. So select those struts and also uncheck visibility. And finally, we need to close this door, go into local transformation, and let's rotate this and move it into the ship. And to move all the objects as a whole, scroll up and select the first option. Now that our ship is fixed, I'm going to move it off to the side behind the main tower. So I'm also going to angle it in the direction that the ship will be traveling. So the ship will start off right here, and then it'll end over there. So let's go move this up. And so it's pretty high up in the air, and move our cursor to the very beginning. To animate this object, we first need to make sure it's selected and then add in a track. So let's go add in the cargo ship and then also add a transform to be able to move the object. So let's go add in a first keyframe right there, move the cursor to the very end, and then move the ship. That's how it's going to end up right here, and add in another cursor. So now when I press the spacebar, our ship is flying across the screen. But there is a speed up and a slowdown, so we need to select both keyframes and set it to linear. Now let's go see what this looks like within our main camera view. Okay, the animation looks really nice. Our world is definitely starting to feel more lived in. And I want to add in another cargo ship. So I'm going to select this one and duplicate it. And then move it. That's how it's in the middle of my valley and at the center of my camera. So it's going to start off right here and then start to slowly come up a little bit, wait a little bit, and then fly off. I'm animating the transform like the other objects. The first and last keyframes are linear, but the middle two are set to interpolate because I want there to be a smooth transition between the ship rising and flying away. Now this is our animation so far. It looks really nice. We have a lot of the main animations in there, but we can add in some smaller animations onto the cargo ship, specifically the thrusters. I want it where the thrusters are pointing down when the ship is rising, and then they change and start to point behind the ship to show the ship is moving away. And to do so, I need to select the ship and see exactly what thrusters I need to animate. And specifically, it is thruster C. So in order to animate this, we need to add in a new track to the ship and select a specific object. So it's thruster C right there. Add in another track, which is a transform. The thruster will be pointing down when the ship is taking off. So add a keyframe right there. And then it starts to move behind the ship, like right there, and add a keyframe like that. So now when the ship takes off, the thrusters are pointing down, but then it turns and flies away. I'm repeating the exact same process, but for the rest of the thrusters. Here's the new animation. It's the little things like the thrusters that move, which can make all the difference. I wanted more animations in the environment, so I added a rover in the foreground. The rover's cargo was open, so I had to close it, and then I animated the wheels spinning, just like how I did with the thrusters turning. And here is my final animation. So it looks really good. And one last change I'm going to make before I render this out is delete the human reference because I no longer need it. Now, in order to render out my animation to a sequence of images, we first have to enable the movie render queue. So go into settings, plugins, and type in movie render queue. Make sure that it is enabled. You will have to restart the engine. After that is enabled, go down and click on this render icon, and this will bring up the movie render queue. So we need to adjust some settings. So click on unsaved config, and this is where we're going to make our settings. First off, we're not going to render it as a JPEG. Instead, we're going to render it as a PNG file. And I'm also going to add in anti-aliasing because it takes a couple frames for lumen lighting to start working, and we are using lumen. So I want to make sure render warm-up frames is enabled, and we can set it to a count of 128. And then for the output, it's going to ask for a location. I already have a file on my desktop called Minerva render. So I'm just going to copy its location and paste it right here. And right now it's set to 24 frames. Just in case, we can see the frame rate on my timeline is right now set to 30 FPS. So let's go override that and select 30 FPS. So these are all my settings. Click accept and then render local. Wait a little bit for your animation to render. After the render is done, if you go into your output folder, you'll see a bunch of images that represent the frames of my animation. In order to convert this into a video, you need to add it into a video editing program like Adobe Premiere Pro, or in my case, DaVinci Resolve. So get all your images and select all of them with Control and A, and simply drag it into your timeline like this. Now, if I press play, we have our finished animation, ready to be exported and shared on the internet. Also, don't forget that Unreal Engine is a video game engine, so we can use our environment that we created for an animation also as a game map. So let's go exit out of the sequencer, and then if I go into world settings, Under Game Mode Override, in the drop-down, select BP_ third person game mode, which we have since we already have the third person content pack installed. Now, if I fly over here and press play, I can play my environment and explore it as if I'm playing a video game, which is really cool. It goes to show how versatile Kitbash assets are. We can use it not only for animations, but for games as well. And with that, we conclude this tutorial. I look forward to seeing what you will create with these assets.